metaphor Refantazio fascinated me so much that it made me ask a question I usually take for granted. Why does fantasy work on us at all? It's the same question that motivated the game's director, Katsura Hashino, who made a 100-hour fantasy RPG without knowing anything about fantasy beforehand. That's insane. He read Lord of the Rings as a quote, crash course, but I believe he's been far, far more inspired by Brandon Sanderson. But Metaphor's weirdly aggressively sincere tone sparks two complex questions. The game presents itself as an epic fantasy, with philosophy, politics, and war, which stands completely at odds with the naive and surface-level world-building. How are you, in fact, meant to take it seriously? This supposedly profound meditation of the self and a better world features an in-game guide called the Talkative Tooth, which is an actual fucking talkative tooth. A wisdom tooth, if you will. That's really stupid, which leads into the other, more important question. What do you stand to gain by taking the game seriously? Nothing, I would argue. Seen as a fairy tale, however, I think every intellectually offensive aspect of this flawed game makes perfect sense. Let me explain why. This analysis contains no spoilers, as the story won't be the focus, but here is a sweeping overview of the game's premise. Metaphor Refantazio takes place in Uchronica, a land deeply divided by prejudice and inequality among its various races and nations. You follow a young protagonist who stumbles upon a book written by the mysterious author Thomas More. Inspired by the visions of an idealized society described in the book, the protagonist embarks on an epic quest alongside a group of diverse companions to confront the world's injustices and unify Uchronica's fractured nations. It all begins with the death of the king, which triggers a magical democracy competition, where the candidate with the most support by a certain date will become the new ruler. We're one of those candidates, though driven by motives and agendas beyond simply becoming king. Before arguing that this seemingly serious story shouldn't be analyzed too critically, we need to look at Hashino's intent and let him explain his take on the genre.
Hashino is best known for directing the Persona series, and while Metaphor shares most of its systems and mechanics with Persona, it replaces modern-day Japan with an entirely original and remarkably lore-rich fantasy world. Interestingly, Hashino himself doesn't seem to know anything or be interested in fantasy. His team practically harassed him into choosing this style.
In an interview with Polygon, he said, "I started asking them, why do you like fantasy? And nobody really had a clear answer. Everybody was a little bit vague. So I got really curious about this idea of fantasy and what makes it so compelling and attractive to people." His curiosity led him to discussions with Japanese fantasy creators, saying, "What I ended up learning from this is that what they thought about fantasy, and what people seem to like about fantasy, is that it's a very free medium where you can do anything that you want to do. It's not limited by the real world in any way." I find this so captivating because he seems honestly curious about what all the fuss is regarding fantasy as a genre, and making this absurdly ambitious game was his way of exploring it. But he didn't go in completely blind, since according to an interview in The Verge, Hashino gave himself a crash course in fantasy, reading books like The Lord of the Rings as a refresher. Never once did I think of The Lord of the Rings while playing Metaphor, but instead I found many parallels to, as previously mentioned, Brandon Sanderson. Sanderson, for those unfamiliar, is an acclaimed American fantasy author, known most notably perhaps for completing The Wheel of Time after Robert Jordan's passing. Since then, he's released books at such a prolific rate that it's become an affectionate meme among fans. Playing this game made me think about his series called The Stormlight Archive, which shares thematic similarities with Metaphor, not the least in its exploration of the concepts of ideals. In fact, Hashino himself emphasized ideals as especially compelling, speaking in a Q&A about fantasy as a medium capable of envisioning utopias where people live harmoniously. And initially I thought critics might dismiss this framing as naive, but most praised the game's sincerity. Jessica Cogswell, reviewing for GameSpot, eloquently captured this idealism, saying, "Thus the game begins with its narrator asking the player an important question. Do you believe that fantasy has the power to drive real change?" Yes, my heart sang. Yet there was a part of me, cloaked in that aforementioned anxiety, that hesitated. Do art, fiction and fantasy mean much in a world ravaged by bombs, inequality, injustice and starvation? Apart from idealism, another central theme is anxiety and the struggle to become our best selves. We put anxiety as the central focus of the game, in part because everyone has anxiety, but if we made a game focused on anxiety in the real world, we'd have to focus on really specific things about how it affects people in the modern world, and we'd drown in the specifics of it. He goes on further and explains that, in metaphor, anxiety manifests not just as an emotion, but also as something physical, an actual particle in the air that you can see. That is something that we wouldn't really be able to do in the real world. This concept solidifies my suspicion that Sanderson's influence outweighs Tolkien's, even though I can't find any proof Hashino has ever read them. In Sanderson's Stormlight archive, emotions manifest physically as creatures called spren, making hiding feelings impossible, a concept that significantly impacts interpersonal dynamics. This inventiveness is precisely why I adore fantasy. You can set imaginative parameters for how the world operates, explore their societal implications, and reflect meaningfully back on our reality. But let's leave Sanderson for a second and talk about the socio-political satire Utopia, published in 1516 and written by Sir Thomas More. It's about a traveler called Raphael, who returns to Europe and gushes about a purportedly perfect nation overseas called Utopia, and what Europe can learn from their sense of justice and how their society is organized. As mentioned, Thomas More also happens to be the name of the author you meet who wrote the book the protagonist carries with him, a book describing an aspirational land of order, peace and harmony. I read the book and it goes into far more detail than the game, presenting in aspects a socialist state without private ownership, while the in-game book leads the specifics of what an utopia is, apart from everybody getting along. This further strengthened my belief that it's worth looking at the story and themes of metaphor as symbolism, rather than seeing it for what it is. It's a fairy tale, and while there is an in-game codex filled to the brim with history, religion, lore and politics, that's usually reserved for Western RPGs. But this is still definitely more Dragon Quest than Dragon Age. However, despite its ambitious world building, metaphor diverges significantly from Sanderson's structured realism. Uchronica's geopolitics and practicalities fall apart under close scrutiny. Yet, I argue, that doesn't matter. Instead, metaphor resembles a fairy tale more than a traditional fantasy epic. Nobody questions Cinderella's plausibility, after all. Fairy tales serve as allegories, teaching simple but potent life lessons. Hansel and Gretel warns about trusting strangers. Beauty and the Beast teaches inner beauty. And metaphor proposes, simply, why can't we all just get along? With this lens, we can look at one of the more critical reviews by Stephanie Liu on Siliconera. While she awarded metaphor an 8 out of 10, she criticized its handling of racism as superficial and simplistic, comparing it unfavorably to Disney's Zootopia. She argues that beneath any serious investigation, the racial allegory quickly crumbles. I feel like a huge part of why the discrimination thing doesn't work for me personally is that it doesn't feel real. Think about the cultures and races in real life that have a bad reputation. As a Chinese person, I'll list a few. We eat anything and everything. We're loud. We're cheap. We're colorist. And so on and so forth. Is there real grounds for all of that? I mean, yeah, kind of. There's a distinct lack of that kind of stuff in metaphor, Refantazio, outside of some mean-spirited comments about physical appearance. I largely agree with her critique, yet viewed as a fairy tale, the simplistic approach to these heavy topics becomes more understandable, if not entirely excusable, for everyone. Fairy tales prioritize conveying clear, concise moral messages, rather than detailed socio-political nuance. Her criticism that the protagonist's vision for a unified, discrimination-free world is idealistic, yet lacks actionable detail, is also fair. But again, fairy tales rarely provide concrete policy proposals. The aspect of the game I found most like a fairy tale, and something that would never happen in a serious fantasy, is related to the book the protagonist carries with him. As he meets new companions, they wonder about the book, and scoffs dismissively when he tells them what it's about. Then they all proceed to read a snippet, and are enamored with the childlike optimism of everyone getting along, despite themselves. It's kind of lame as fuck, honestly, but this is a, here it comes, metaphor for how you, the player, should try and experience this game. It's not Dragon Age, Game of Thrones, The Witcher, Final Fantasy, or even Brandon Sanderson, and most certainly not Lord of the Rings. It won't hold up under the same analytical lens, and I don't believe it's meant to. So ignore the lore spewing in-game codex and embrace it as a comforting and inspiring fairy tale, or an escapist fantasy. Reflect on why its idealized world feels insanely distant to you, rather than picking apart the lore details or examine its surface-level politics. With that expectation, you're in for one of the most memorable and best RPGs of recent years, and certainly the most unique. Thank you for watching.